Welcome back, everyone, to a brand new reaction series from Extra History. We're diving into some Asian history today. We are going to take a look at their series on Genghis Khan. As always, there's a link in the description that'll take you to the original content so you can check it out without my commentary. This is a subject I don't know a lot about. So, as it says on the heading of my channel, learning history together. That's what we're here to do. So we're here to learn from each other. I'm going to be learning along with you. I'll offer some insight, do some research as necessary to kind of fill in some things. But let's go ahead and dive into this story.
Gives birth to a son on an isolated hillside under the vast Mongolian sky, surrounded by strangers and far away from everything she had ever known. He would grow up to be a leader, to unite the nomadic tribes of Northeast Asia, to found the largest contiguous empire humanity has ever known.
So what does that mean? Contiguous empire means it all touches each other. It's kind of like the contiguous 48 states in the United States, because Alaska and Hawaii don't touch the rest of the U.S., which all touch each other. Same thing here. Obviously, the British Empire was larger at its greatest extent than this. But this is all in one place. So at the time, just absolutely enormous, especially when you consider the technology. He's not using a massive navy to do this. He doesn't even have necessarily a massive army, and he doesn't have communication ability. You know, it's not like if you're over in Eastern Europe, you can send a message to Korea and get it there in a day or two.
He would grow up to be Genghis Khan. The story of Genghis Khan truly begins with his mother, Hoelun. A young warrior traveled to her tribe in search of a wife. He brought gifts for her and her family, and he lived and worked with them for several years. Then, according to steppe tradition, they married. Once married, they set out on a weeks-long journey back to his homeland and his tribe.
It's kind of cool to think about the fact that in every culture there seems to be this idea of marriage. Now, granted, I don't know if marriage happens the way we think of it as marriage in their culture. Maybe somebody can fill me in on that. But it seems like every culture has some kind of ceremony in which a man and a woman would be joined together to start a family. Now, a lot of them had, obviously multiple wives in different cultures, things like that. But we have to remember, too, that this is a time in history when the world is very sparsely populated compared to what it is today. I think I read somewhere recently that we're supposed to hit 8 billion people on the planet today. Well, at this time that we're talking about around 1,200. There's, I think, 400 million people at that time. So, I mean, just a tiny fraction of what we have today. So in a space like this, it's really spread out. So there's vast swaths of territory where there's just nobody there.
But as they crossed the isolated mountain valleys together, they were ambushed by a group of hunters. These valley hunters, who were far too poor to afford the wedding gifts necessary to secure a marriage with a woman like Hoelun, resorted to the second most common way of obtaining a wife on the steppes: kidnapping. The couple knew that it was only a matter of time before the hunters found them. Hoelun, barely more than a teenager, embraced her husband one last time, and then, in a moment of true sacrifice, convinced him to escape without her. If she stayed behind, the hunters would be so preoccupied with her that her husband would have a chance to escape. As legend tells, as her love turned to ride away, she took off her shirt and gave it to him so that he would remember her smell. In the tradition of the steppe, each person's breath and smell constitutes a part of their soul. By giving her husband her shirt, she was offering him a reminder of her love and her very essence.
I gotta admit, I did not expect the story of Genghis Khan to start with a love story. Wow, that's fascinating stuff. Of course, it starts with a love story, but it ends with a story where I've read estimates that Genghis Khan's wars of conquest between the people who died in battle and the people who died of disease and starvation could have been as high as 60 million, which if you're talking 60 million and a world population of 400 million, you're talking about like 1/7, 1/6 of the world's entire population. Now that's the high end estimate. It could have been as low as just a few million, but it's somewhere in there. Either way, it's significant.
This was the last time Hoelun and her husband would ever see each other. She was brought to live with her kidnapper, a man named Yisuge, and his extended family, including another wife and their 3 young children. Not long after, Hoelun gave birth to her first child, a son. The boy was named Temujin, after a respected warrior that Yisuge had recently killed in battle. But Temujin didn't...
Now that seems weird to us, but it wouldn't have been to many cultures in the world. To have killed a great warrior, there was a lot of respect that was shown in a situation like that. To the point where they name a child after a guy that he killed in battle. I mean, it's a very fascinating aspect of culture.
Not appear to live up to his namesake. He was a very timid child, easily frightened, scared of dogs, often bullied by his older half-brothers. His father spared no love for him, once even forgetting him and leaving him behind when the tribe packed up to move to a new camp.
So I love hearing stories like this because whether we recognize it or not, we are all shaped by the events of our childhood. Those events mold us into who we become, and some people are irrevocably damaged by things that happen in childhood. And that's what angers me so much when I hear stories about parents abusing or neglecting their children, because they don't even realize that they're not only hurting them for that moment, that they are causing lifelong damage in those situations, not only to that child, but potentially to other people who might become victims of that child because of how they were treated. And some people, the abuse and the treatment that they take as a child forms them into a strong person. Other people, they get damaged and they become a hurt person who then goes on to hurt other people. I'm going to guess there's probably a mix of that with Genghis Khan, but I guess we'll see.
So when Temujin turned 8, the earliest age at which it was acceptable to arrange a marriage for a boy, his father went out to find a family to marry him off to. Hoelun asked that they try to find a wife from her tribe, so he could grow up knowing some of his extended family, and it was agreed. They would ride to Hoelun's tribe. A few days into their journey, they stopped at a small yurt to eat and rest. The family hosting them had a young daughter named Borte. The children seemed to get along, and after some negotiation, Yisuge arranged for Temujin to work for the family for several years as a sort of dowry. By the time his service was complete, the children would be old enough to marry.
Reminds me of a story from the Old Testament, the story of these 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. And along comes Jacob, who wants to marry one of them. He wants to marry one of them, but he wants to marry the younger sister, Rachel. She's the one he wants, but he makes this deal to where he'll work for the father for 7 years, and then he can marry her. Well, he works for 7 years, and the father says, well, actually, I should marry off my older daughter first, so you need to marry Leah instead. So he does. And then he works 7 more years in order to be able to marry Rachel. So seems as though that was a common way of doing things in many cultures.
Thus, Temujin was betrothed to Borte, and his father left him behind to return to his wives and other children. Along the way back, Yisuge came across a group of warriors celebrating a feast. As he sat down to join them, one of them recognized him as the man who had killed their comrade, Temujin, the man Yisuge had named his son after. To exact revenge, they secretly poisoned his food. The poison didn't kill him immediately. He survived long enough to stagger home to his camp. His family realized the end was near and sent a messenger to summon Temujin, but they were too late. By the time Temujin returned, his father had died. Without anyone to provide for them, the 2 wives and 7 children Yisuge left behind were forced to fend for themselves.
First of all, I gotta say it's fascinating that we know this much about his story. Now, how much of it is stuff that was invented later? You know, for example, you think of George Washington. George Washington becomes this great American hero, and after he's gone, there is a story that crops up about him chopping down the cherry tree and saying, I cannot tell a lie. And, you know, those kinds of stories crop up about figures who rise to almost mythological status, but they're not always true. And it makes me wonder how much of this really happened and how much of this was the Genghis Khan spin machine after the fact. But who knows?
As their tribe abandoned them, Hoelun mounted a horse and mile after mile followed them, holding her husband's horsehair spirit banner aloft to remind them of the service he'd done. An old man took pity on them and spoke up, saying that the band should be ashamed of abandoning the family of a warrior. That moment forever changed Temujin, because, for his kindness, the old man was run through with a spear. Temujin was devastated. This tragic event marked the beginning of a long, harsh road that would eventually turn this young boy into Genghis Khan.
Man, you can see, my wife's school counselor and taking a lot of psychology classes and things like that, and she and I have talked about a lot of this stuff. It just, after the fact, going back and looking at the events of a person's life, it's so easy sometimes to see how they shaped them and molded them into the person they became. You don't see it at the time as it's happening in real time, but man, these are important events in a young kid's life, especially in a warrior culture.
That night, the tribe stole the family's animals and left, seemingly condemning them to certain death.
Yeah.
But once again, Hoelun saved not just her children, but the entire extended family.
Great woman.
She spent days foraging for food. The children bent her sewing needles into fish hooks and made arrows from sticks to hunt rats and small birds. They learned to tie bones to their shoes to make ice skates, both to play and also to hunt animals across the ice. Temujin learned not only survival techniques, but fundamental tactics. Temujin had few friends aside from his siblings and half-siblings in the isolated steppe, but he did manage to befriend another child whose family sometimes camped nearby, a slightly older boy named Genghis. The boys hunted and played and explored the mountains together. Twice in their childhood, they swore an oath to be ande, or blood brothers. The first time, early in their friendship, they traded dice made from the knuckle bones of sheep, one of the few luxuries available to a child on the steppe. The second time, as young teenagers, they traded handmade arrowheads. After years of surviving as outcasts, Temujin's older brother began to assert himself as the leader of the family. To show his dominance, he stole a fish that Temujin had caught. Later that same day, he stole a bird that Temujin had shot while hunting. Upset, Temujin and his half-brother Belgute went to their mother to tell her what happened. She said that they should worry more about the tribe who had abandoned them than fighting amongst themselves.
I like her. Boy, this is a strong woman who, he probably doesn't become who he is without his mother, especially without a father now at this point. And again, here you have a brother exerting dominance, and you're going to go to mom and try to deal with it rationally. And she's going to give you words of wisdom, but I'm curious to see whether or not he takes that wisdom, or if we're going to see that fighting spirit come out in him, where he's going to show that even though I'm the younger brother, I'm still going to dominate you.
Emotions raged, and Temujin stormed out. He would take matters into his own hands. He had had enough of other people taking from him. Killing his half-brother would make him the oldest male in the family. Then he would answer to no one. Temujin and Belgute tracked their older brother to a secluded spot in the woods. Their half-brother warned them that without him, they would have no allies left in the world. But the two brothers fired their arrows, and the shots were true. When they returned, their mother could read their actions on their faces. She was distraught. Before, they had been living as outcasts, but spilling blood made them criminals. As a wanted fugitive, Temujin was forced to flee, but he was quickly tracked down and captured by the very clan that had abandoned him years before. He was put in stocks and made to live as a servant to the tribe's slaves. But Temujin did not resign himself to this fate. Yeah,
so again, here's one of those moments in history where you have a choice to make. He's done something that he thought would put him on top, and instead it knocks him to the bottom. Some people would be defeated by that. Some people would give up after that. But people with strong spirits, the people who rise to the top, tend to be ones who don't let anything. I mean, I see a lot of parallels here with Admiral Yi, another great Asian historical figure, where we're talking about, some guy who just gets repeatedly knocked to the bottom and just finds a way to grind back to the top every single time.
He bided his time, waiting for the right moment. One day, he had been put under the care of a particularly small and easily distracted young boy. The warriors in the tribe were intoxicated after a day spent drinking. When nobody was looking, Temujin quickly swung his stocks around and knocked his young guard unconscious. Putting his self-taught tactics to work, he hid in some reeds nearby. He knew that his captors would assume that he had tried to run away and attempt to chase after him.
So we're dealing with brawn, strength, knocking the guy out, but also brains, understanding tactics, knowing your opponent, knowing what they're going to do and anticipating that move. Smart stuff.
Once the warriors had left the camp, Temujin escaped his stocks with the aid of a sympathetic local family and fled into the night. Now 16 years old, Temujin had not seen his intended wife in 7 years. He went to find her, and surprisingly, she had waited for him to return. Despite knowing of his troubles with the steppe tribes, her family agreed to let the wedding proceed. According to custom, brides made a gift of clothing to the fathers of their husbands. The family offered Temujin a fine coat of black sable, the most prized fur on the steppe. But since Temujin's father was long dead, he had a better idea for how to use the coat. He approached an old ally of his father, Ong Khan, the leader of a prosperous tribe. Yusuke had fought by Ong Khan's side long ago and helped him overthrow his uncle to become the tribe's leader. Family ties were sacred in steppe culture. Alliances were never forged in ink, only by blood. Anyone related to you was an ally. Literally everyone else was assumed to be an enemy. By presenting the coat to Ong Khan, Temujin was symbolically recognizing him as his father. Ong Khan accepted, recognizing Temujin as his son, and thus entitling both him and his family to the Khan's protection. He offered to make Temujin a local leader over other young warriors, but shockingly, Temujin declined. With his family's protection assured, he returned to his home camp to...
I'm curious to know what his reason was for declining that. This is a guy who's been fighting and fighting and fighting to get to the top, but maybe he recognizes it's not his time. Maybe he recognizes you need to learn more, or maybe it's just a matter of, if I take this position, I'm once again endangering my family, and right now I'm just worried about my family's protection and survival. I don't want to do anything that's going to put a target on me.
Finally enjoy a peaceful life at home. His troubles must have seemed far behind him now that all the children were old enough to work in some way. They had their own camp, and they were under the protection of a powerful Khan. Temujin would have preferred to remain the ruler of this intimate clan, but the chaotic world of the steppe would not allow such a life. Learning that Temujin had married, the tribe from which Temujin's father had abducted his mother, Hoelun, decided that the time was ripe to take revenge for her abduction. Although Temujin's father was no longer alive, revenge was a family obligation.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm surprised that they had never given up on that story from, we're talking, 20 years at this point. Very interesting to see where this goes. I didn't realize how much of this was kind of a family story and not just about government and invasions. And obviously that's all coming, but again, I love how Extra History tells a story. They get you right in there and kind of give it in such a narrative that makes it really easy to connect to. So I'm excited to learn more, and we'll be back tomorrow with part 2 of this. Let me know your thoughts. Add to the conversation that we've talked about so far, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.